we know there are issues in the marketplace. Some of them can't be answered today, but we'd like to look at this from a positive rather than a negative point of view. I'm sure there will be some negative stuff. But let me get Tim to introduce himself first. But also what I'd like you to do, Tim, once you've introduced yourself, is give a bit of a one-liner on where you think the relationship is between suppliers and brokers at the moment. And it'll be the same question for everyone else. Okay, Tim.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tim Hipperson. I'm the founder and MD of Hipperson Consulting. We have one foot in the regulatory space, providing subject matter expertise and support into Ofgem and the likes of Retco. And we have one foot in the B2B energy space, providing some consultancy support to the energy value chain, so to speak. In terms of my view on where the relationship between suppliers and brokers are, it's a difficult one to say. I'm not at the coal face like these guys are. I don't run a brokerage. I don't run a supplier. I do see it quite often, though, in the work we do. And I would say that the...
So one-liner, by the way. I don't want an essay.
My answer is you're going to get a better response from these guys. I know much more about the regulatory space.
I don't like that. John.
Hi, I'm John Horn, Vice Chair of the ECA and CEO of Fidelity Energy. Where do we sit with suppliers? We all work very well with suppliers, so relationships are pretty good. I think the overriding tensions are the regulation being forced on TPIs via Retco and Ofgem and others, via suppliers, when a number of suppliers, we think, don't quite have it right themselves. That's not everyone, but there's certainly a few out there that are responsible for a lot of the bad broker behaviour that we do see, that are impacting all of us very heavily. So that's, I guess, a frustration. The only other major frustration that I think we as all TPIs experience is the undercutting of suppliers direct when their prices are cheaper than we're able to access from our price books, which, if you think about it economically, is quite, pretty poor, because how can it be cheaper to service via a direct sales team than it is via a channel? So those are the things that I'd be most keen to talk about.
Chris?
Chris Shaw, I'm CEO of Utility Bidder and Chair of the ECA. I'd echo John's comments around the direct relationship in terms of fighting against suppliers with direct arms. There are other marketplaces that John knows pretty well, like telecoms, where they've been able to fix those types of issues. That's challenging. I've been in the market for 10 years, and I actually think today the general relationship between most brokers and suppliers is probably the best that it's been. But there are hurdles still. Fraud is a big issue for many brokers. It's difficult for suppliers to talk openly about it. They're a fairly closed book. You can understand the reasons why. There's very limited data sharing on fraud between brokers and suppliers. There's very limited activity to try and combat fraud. So yeah, I think fraud for me is the biggest area where there are issues, but generally I think things are pretty good.
And Dan's from a supplier, so well done, Dan, for being here.
So yeah, I'm Dan Sullivan. I'm the Vice President of UK Sales at Cefa Energy. Where do I think the relationship between brokers and suppliers is? Well, I'm not here to speak on behalf of the other suppliers. I'm here to speak, obviously, in terms of our relationships with our TPIs. We run a partnership model, so we work very, very closely with all of our TPI partners. We don't work with every TPI in the market directly. So, and I've been in the market for 20 years. I've seen many, many different ways of workings and the relationships between brokers and the suppliers. I would echo that what Chris has just stated there in terms of, I think it's, from an industry point of view, is in a better place than it's possibly ever been in my 20 years of being in the industry. But there are always gaps and there are always rooms for improvement on both sides.
We've got quite a lot of subjects to cover here, so we might flit a little bit, but I want to go back to that fraud thing. Just talk me through it from a... Actually, can we start with Dan, actually, because he is a supplier.
Thank you.
You know that I love you. But this fraud thing that Chris is talking about, you probably are seeing it, and is it a difficult, it's complex subject matter?
It's a very complex subject matter. We definitely have seen over the past years where I've been at Cefa definitely some practices that have been fraudulent. We've seen a number of issues which we've had to deal with commercially and discreetly in some of those pieces. Usually when we are working with a broker partner, We'll work closely together on what those kind of things look like, especially in the change of tenancy market. Has been a very difficult one for suppliers and for brokers on that side, if it's coming obviously from those type of customers that unfortunately are playing games with the market. It's very, very difficult. And I think for us in CEFA, we've put the right protocols in place to be in the best position we are, especially around those kind of pieces. But very, very difficult, and there's a lot of work that we've got to do between ourselves as suppliers and brokers, and we keep on saying suppliers and brokers, between us as partners really, to make sure that we clean up that market, but ensure that we've got the right regulatory processes and access and communication to have that really nailed down.
Chris, is this broker fraud, customer fraud? I'm not going to say supplier fraud because it's probably more from the customer and the broker, but is it that you're just looking at both of those, or is there one particular?
I think the biggest area of issues in fraud have been, as I've seen it, has been through sub-brokers, which have impacted aggregators. Fraud occurs in many ways. You've got instances of people taking over meters, setting up fake energy companies, knocking on people's doors, getting them to sign a direct debit, customers paying the fake business a direct debit, 20p, 15p per kilowatt, thinks it's an amazing deal. The business that's taken over the meter identifies a supplier whose own payment teams don't even bother to start chasing people for 9, 10, 12 months. They play the system, they understand where the weaknesses are within suppliers' debt platforms. And then finally, the customer gets a knock at the door, hasn't paid a bill, and says, well, I've been paying my bill for 6, 12 months. You've got issues where sub-brokers find an aggregator, set a relationship up, get the money off the aggregator, then do a load of dodgy cots. And then when you start to put fraud analytics in, you can start to connect that the directors are involved within multiple sub-brokers, and they're just flipping the cots round. I think the issue for suppliers, there are some suppliers, more mainstream suppliers, that have been hit by tens of millions of pounds of issues. There are brokers that have been hit by millions of pounds worth of issues. In a previous industry I was involved in, which was the insurance industry, car insurance industry, we had similar issues in terms of whiplash and fraud and all the things that people have seen on the TV over the years, ambulance chasers. And they built a fraud solution that allowed insurers and third-party organisations to share information. There is no reason why we can't set up the same fraud exchange network around Chatham House closed environment rules, where suppliers can freely share information with brokers, and we can share information back, and we can cut fraud. At the moment, the only way to deal with fraud is you put a burglar alarm on your house and you hope that someone burgles your next door neighbour. My fraud defence in my company, as good as they can be,
Slightly cynical.
and the fraud is going to impact somebody else because they'll just go for an easier target, and that's not the way it should be.
Okay, I'm assuming, John, Tim, you were both nodding, so you probably don't have much else to add. That was a good pick-up there. Or, John, do you want to add something to that?
No, I think Chris
Helps using the microphone.
Sorry, no, I think Chris has nailed that one. Yeah, I mean, sub-broker fraud, we're specifically telco-related, our sub-broker, so we don't tend to see much of it. But, you can see it pretty quickly, and it is a bit of a constant battle. So there are, we've got some informal circles between some of the big aggregators that share some of that information, but we're very keen to kind of formalise that. And I know Simon is trying to push to get the police involved in those forums as well, because it's just time-consuming and sapping for everyone involved in this market. This sort of stuff goes on, and it can be stopped. So yeah, we just need to get on and stop it, really.
Tim, you want to add?
Well, only that, I agree with everybody here. I mean, sharing information between brokers has always been brokers have always wanted to protect their own data and information, but I think this is a topic where information does need to be shared. We see it sometimes shared on the LinkedIn platforms, and some people pick it up, but I think a formal process with the involvement of Crime Stoppers or the police that allows, because I think this will stop, not stop, but we'll start seeing it slow down when we start seeing prosecutions happen. And at the moment, we're not seeing any prosecutions happen because it's not being targeted and identified the way it should be. So I think this is the best start for doing that.
Dan?
It's not just, I completely agree with what you said there, it's also not just from sub-brokers. We have also seen instances in the market of customers or customers to a supplier thinking they've signed a customer contract that's a multi-site contract in essence, but actually that consortium are then acting as though they are the supplier to these customers and invoicing them, reselling that kind of energy, etc. And to the suppliers, they've got this contract at whatever price that may be, being paid by this consortium. But actually, the customers have got no idea who their suppliers are. So there are circumstances on that, some of which I can't go into because there are confidential cases actually going on. But we're trying to work very, very closely, and we have. It has been really time consuming on some of those, especially for us as a supplier, and trying to report those in the right way. And we've dealt with Ofgem and regulatory bodies for those, and then also Crime Stoppers, police, etc. Very, very time consuming, and on some of it, you feel like you're hitting your head against a brick wall, and it's really, really difficult. So we as a supplier then have to try and protect those actual physical end users and go and speak to them and do what we can as a supplier, which we've taken those actions ourselves. But that it's a really, really difficult matter that doesn't just end at sub-brokers. I do think that's a huge part, but there's also other things in the market we've got to look out for.
I'm going to come to you, John, but feel free to come in at any time, by the way. So I knew you were itching there.
Yeah, I think the biggest frustration for us with Ofgem, look, Ofgem do some good, right? We understand that. But Ofgem are solely focused on the whole problem in the market being brokers and brokers' commissions. And they're just completely wide of the mark. That's not the problem whatsoever. The bigger problems are mis-selling, selling flex contracts as fixed contracts. We've got suppliers like BES, where the guy's doing 14 years in prison, still operating, now under Ruby Energy. We've got other well-known suppliers that are doing exactly what we just talked about. They're all being investigated. We all know who they are. But why are they still in the market? Why are we focused? Why is Ofgem focusing all their resources on the 1p or 1.5p uplift brokers are making when they're completely ignoring the big problems that are actually the real things that are impacting small customers, social working clubs in Newcastle? These are the problems. They're just not being addressed by all of the reforms that are going through. Won't fix any of these major issues that are, if you understand what brokers are up to, they're the really big issues that brokers' customers are facing.
I've written to Ofgem twice asking them to facilitate a fraud discussion, and there's been no interest from Ofgem to do that.
It's political.
I think fraud's an interesting one, right? Because we have the Fraud Act. There's already legislation in that covers fraud, and so I think there is a case of there's something there already, and it's up to the person who experiences the fraud to report that fraud and see it through. And so if you see a case of fraud, then there are routes for you to report that through Action Fraud, through police. So there is a legislative framework already in place for that. What I think needs to happen is that these things need to be identified and reported. And there's definitely a role that for Ofgem potentially in facilitating that and creating a framework or a forum that allows that to occur. But in terms of fraud, there already is. The Fraud Act is in place and it's there to protect consumers against fraud. It's just it has to be enabled.
For people that might have missed the question, it was about, why is Ofgem not doing anything about it? And I know that you have frustrations with Ofgem.
I don't know. That's the answer to the question. I don't know. They should be, but they're not.
I think the answer is, where's all this regulation in the last couple of years come from? It's come from questions being asked in the House of the Parliament about broker commissions on contracts sold by companies that we all know in the North East that have exploited small customers. MPs have got sick of it. The Tory government were told, said to Ofgem, sort this out, it's embarrassing everybody. And Ofgem went, right, let's get on the case and basically go and attack brokers. What they didn't do was take a balanced view of the market, understand what's going on in the market. It was a political decision driven before the last general election, which has now gone down a rabbit hole. And that's why I think Ofgem aren't listening, because they don't listen to us, they only listen to politicians and big energy suppliers.
I'm going to caveat what I'm about to say by saying I'm not here to defend the regulators. Okay.
Okay.
I'm not
by the way, we're not going to turn this into an Ofgem bashing. So let's try and get this closed off in a minute or two. Otherwise, we're not going to go through the other subjects.
I do think first of all, it's RECCO and DESNES who are looking at the regulation of brokers. I know Ofgem have the forums and they're doing things, but it's a slightly different regulatory companies who are looking at the broker piece. I think the commission piece is one bit of the regulatory landscape that they're trying to implement. I think this is being driven by, politically, I'm sure, you only have to look at Hansard and type in broker and see what comes up in the conversations they have. But it's also being driven by consumer groups identifying consumer harm that they want addressed. Okay, so you have Citizens Advice have written reports on this lot, Institute of Directors, Chambers of Commerce, Federation of Small Business. These are organisations who have expressed concern that their members are experiencing detriment at the hands of brokers, and so these regulatory bodies are trying to address those concerns. Commission, as you say, it gets the headlines because that's the bit that's going to impact brokers most.
Look, wait a minute. I'm going to move this on.
I think it's an important point.
No, absolutely. And you talk about your commissions, and it's a bit like the football agents, and everyone goes, blimey, he made $6 million for moving Ronaldo there. Unfortunately, you're getting a little bit tired with some of that. So I want to move on to the RECO Code of Practice, okay? I'll have a nice broad question, and John, you can hone in as much as you like. What do you think it's going to mean for brokers and suppliers? So I'm going to start with you, John, I know I can see.
I think, I think we're all up for more compliance. RECO, we're spending a lot of time and effort on building out a training academy for all of our ECA members and for everyone else to access if they choose to want to do it. I think if we look bigger, yes, RECO is one level of compliance. I think we are going to end up under the same sort of banner of FCA compliance when Ofgem do get around to doing it. And that is going to make a revolutionary shift in our market. If you look at the insurance industry that went through this sort of 10 years ago, there was 2,000 insurance brokers. There's now 10 proper brokers, massively regulated. So if you're a small TPI sitting there going, oh, do I use an aggregator? Do I try and do it all myself? I think the questions I'll be thinking about now are, where's this market going? And are you going to be able to become fully FCA type compliant within 18 months, which is where this could well go?
Can I just clarify? So you believe that this code of practice is taking us down so when I deal with a mortgage broker, he has to tell me how much money he's getting from the finance company or the bank or the building society, and then he might also want to charge me if he doesn't think he's making enough, or he charges me a fixed fee. So effectively we're going down that, and they have to fill in lots of notes, and they need to be able to prove or justify.
And the directors go to prison if they commit anything wrong, which is going to, again, stamp out a lot of the problems that we are seeing.
Okay, right, so we're definitely going down that route, you believe?
I think so.
Okay, so that does mean for smaller brokers, they're going to have a much more compliance issue to deal with.
Yeah, totally.
Yes, so the TPI Code of Practice, if you haven't seen it, has got 32 compliance points, the principles that you have to comply with. They range from transparency, we've already discussed, but things down to data protection policies and access control policies, and the things that you would want to see in a professional business. So the idea is, it's, as John says, we are moving. The market is transitioning towards this regulated environment. We have RECO doing it through code changes, which means that suppliers can only work with brokers who are accredited to this code of practice, and we can talk through the process later if you want to. You have DESNES at the moment who are looking at, can we centrally regulate brokers directly, not through the supplier license, but can we regulate them directly? It is all moving to a space where the market is going to be regulated, and you are going to have to comply with these principles. And if you haven't seen these principles, the hope is that Ofgem will approve them in March for delivery at the end of Q3, Q4 next year. So you need to start familiarising yourself with the rules under which you are going to have to play going forwards.
Okay, let me just ask a question of the audience. Who thinks that they're up with this whole RECO code of practice and are happy? Hands up. Well, one at the back. Oh, no, there's a few more. Okay. So quite a lot of you got some work to do. These guys are really good people to talk to about it, by the way.
Yeah, can I just give the ECA a plug?
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things the ECA does is it makes available all the documentation, all the things that we think you're going to have to do to step up to become a compliant. Tim's written a lot of the content, the documentation we offer to all of our members as standard, and we're rolling out a training academy on Monday that means you can meet all of your compliance from a training point of view for bribery, corruption, GDPR, and then treat customers fairly.
And it's bloody cheap.
If you are struggling with any of this stuff, talk to the guys at the ECA because they're a good place to start.
Chris,
I'll split my answer into two parts. What's RECO going to do for brokers? I'm not going to cover the same stuff that John and Tim have already covered, and then what's it going to do for suppliers? My concerns around RECO, I think the principles of RECO are great in terms of that drive towards regulation. My concerns are, does the RECO code of practice have teeth to deal with people that don't bother to abide by it? John Dixon confirmed at an event a few months ago that they expect they'll audit brokers between every 2 and 5 years. I think that is going to cause some problems. There will inevitably be brokers that will fully support it. There'll be good brokers that do that, and there'll be bad brokers that think, how are the ways that I can circumvent it? My concerns are, unless it's got teeth, unless brokers feel that if you don't abide by the rules, you will not be able to trade, some brokers will find loopholes and will not adhere to it. Second part of the answer is around the impact on suppliers. At the moment, we've got instances where some suppliers will win business with not the cheapest rate. And some suppliers might win business because they perhaps induce brokers, or they'll give them 4 or 5p uplift. They'll sell out for 2 years. They'll pay commission really, really quickly up front. And you can argue that's just commercial market behaviour. But you'll see certain brokers that put very high levels of volume with 1 or 2 suppliers, and those suppliers aren't the cheapest. Under ECO, that shouldn't happen, because the brokers should follow cheapest price, or will have to be explaining to customers, I've not done a whole market review, I've only looked at 2 suppliers. If the broker does the proper job under ECO, some suppliers that operate and get business by arguably inducing brokers because of commercial benefit will stop winning business that way. They'll have to become more competitive on price, which I personally think is a really good thing. But I think the whole supply mix of how brokers place business with suppliers could come under scrutiny, especially in the larger usage stuff. I think it might follow more of a SME pattern where, you know, your likes of BG and EDF take a big chunk of the volume because they're typically the cheapest within that smaller SME, micro SME segment.
Okay. You just wanted to mention one point.
It was just on the audit piece. Chris is absolutely right. The code of practice, the legal text states that brokers will be subject to a full audit every 2 to 5 years, and the full audit means an audit against every single one of those 32 principles, but they will also be subject to risk-based audits every year. And risk-based audits are where they will pull out a particular principle and say, show me you're complying to this one principle based on the risk they're seeing in the market. So yes, you're right, the full audit piece, there are people who might think we're going to trade for 2 years, then close down so we don't get audited and get away with stuff, but they will also be subject to these smaller audits, these risk-based audits in between.
Okay. Dan, I want your view on RICO.
So when we talk about RICO from a supplier perspective, and obviously sitting here on stage, I echo a lot of what's been said from the guys here, and definitely what John was saying there. It's just in regards to what John stated, it's a matter of time, and whether that is 18 months or 24, or I don't think it's going to be any sooner than those. But definitely as a message to all TPIs out here, and you know, people that have come today, if you haven't looked at the ECA, have a look right now, because change is coming, and you really need to be on board with what that's going to look like. There are going to be impacts for TPIs in the market. There's going to be impacts, as Chris has stated there, in terms of suppliers. We're comfortable with how that model looks like when we talk about going back towards the price sensitive piece, and how that works. It works very closely with our strategy, and our partners in here today will hopefully say exactly that. Otherwise, I'll get lots of questions and be shouted at. But we're comfortable with where those changes are going. There's more work that probably needs to be done on that. I think there's actually a bit of work that brokers and suppliers can do together in terms of what that's going to look like and how that impacts. That's for each supplier to do that. I know, we offer that out to all of our partners, and I've got partners here on stage, so I hope that they'll echo that we do that, and we have very, very good, constructive conversations about where the regulations are going and what that's going to look like for our relationship as we go forwards.
Okay, I'm going to move us on. We've only really got about 5 minutes, but I'm also going to take questions from the audience. So the last subject, and I know there are loads of others to do, ADR. Okay, I'm sorry, and I'm going to let you start, Chris, because
thank you.
And the question was, ADR, is it fit for purpose? And I know this could be quite enjoyable.
It's a fucking shambles, is what my view is. So let's quickly roll the clock back to December 22, when Ofgem pushes ADR out. ADR is a really good thing. You know, my personal view, I think it's a brilliant thing for people who who need to get redress against a broker, can go through a more informal process than going through a county court process, because county court process can be a bit arduous. So it gets launched in December 22. There's only one provider, and the Energy Ombudsman and Ofgem have been arguably in cahoots to get the thing set up. And it's really pushed heavily to all the brokers. Unless you sign up with the EO, by the time the scheme goes live, you can't trade. So the Energy Ombudsman signed up 2,000 brokers at 350 quid a pop. That's the application fee. And all they do
I'm
is...
in the wrong business.
all they do, Yeah, there's no validation checking of disqualified directors as far as I can see. There's no fraud linkage stuff doing. They just give you an ADR number. £700,000 you rake in. And in the first year, they do about 1,000 cases. They award 600 to 700 of them in favour of the consumer. And they charge £340 per case. The typical award, when we finally got the information, was around £500. So in that first year, the whole scheme cost, on average, over £1,000 to make a decision, and the actual award was £500. If they'd gone through county court, it would have cost 70 quid, and it cost over £1,000. So we've been pushing through the ECA to try and get more ADR providers into the space. The problem is there's loads of misinformation about it. Even the Energy Ombudsman's own website says that they're an approved provider. Well, Ofgem have admitted they don't approve anybody. All you need to do to be an ADR provider is you need to adhere to what's called QDSS, which is the Qualifying Dispute Settlement Scheme. There's providers on the Ofgem website that are apparently QDSS that aren't QDSS, and there's a lot of intelligence being formed to suggest that the Energy Ombudsman, because their staff are not legally trained, aren't QDSS as well. And all of these issues fall back on suppliers, because it's not the broker's issue, it's the supplier's licence conditions. So the whole thing is a complete shambles. It should have been thought out and properly calculated. They just rushed it through. And all of these costs, all those £1,000 costs, we as brokers are putting back onto customers. They say it's a free service. Of course it's not a free service. Brokers aren't just taking it out of the profits and saying, I'm only going to make X amount. It all gets passed back to customers. It's a complete shambles.
Chris, can you speak your mind now?
I can't. That's
He's not allowed to use swear words. I told him he wasn't allowed to use swear words. Yeah, I am coming to you. Oh no, you do.
I think one of the great ironies with the scheme has proven the sheer number of complaints was 1,000. You said came in the first
1,000 in year one, yeah.
So how many complaints do suppliers get reported? I think it was, I saw the other day one supplier alone had 14,000 complaints in a year. So if you consider there's 2,000 TPIs, we're responsible for 75% of the switches. The problem clearly isn't with TPIs, is it? That's the
whoa. There's probably a lot of domestic complaints in there. Come on, John, you've got to be a little bit fair. We're talking about business energy here. I'm going to put an editorial hat on. It doesn't happen very often, but I will put an editorial hat on. Dan, I think you need to have a say here.
Thanks. So I'm not going to be as sat on the fence as Chris was. But so when we talk about the ADR schemes, that suppliers at this moment in time, the way it works, it does come back to us in terms of those issues, and it is pushed back to us on a number of those pieces where they go through the ADR schemes and how that works. But we are, as a supplier, we have to, as part of our licensing conditions, work with whoever's going to be there in terms of those dispute resolutions. And if there are other options that are coming into the market or coming into the actual process, then we as a supplier will obviously support that, and whoever that may be. We definitely want it to be correct and legal on those pieces. As you know, with the ADR scheme, the way it works now, if it was a complaint against us, for instance, and we are found to be the guilty party, we have no appeal process at all. Whereas obviously customers and TPIs, or TPIs on behalf of the customer, can appeal if it had gone against them on that front. So I think that's something that could do with looking at addressing when we look at some of the appeals that have gone through some of the ADRs, and we definitely want it to be as as legally qualified as we need it to be, because again, for us it's legal because it affects our licenses, it affects where we sit on Trustpilots, etc., and obviously reputation from that point. I think when I look at Cefa, for instance, we have a very, very good complaint record and stand strong on that front, but that's because we work very, very closely with Ofgem, with DESNZ and our regulatory team working on that, but definitely open to change. And I was asked a question last week, and I think Simon asked me as well, can you post it on LinkedIn, that would we work with someone like the DRO who may become an ADR? Yes, we would, if they were absolutely put through that assessment and away we go. Yes, we would.
Okay, so what you asked for is more choice and better choice.
All we want is consistently accurate decision-making by an ADR provider. That's the minimum requirement, and I don't think that's unfair for us to ask for that.
Well, I would agree. So I think this market does need an ADR scheme. I think it's only fair and appropriate that there is one. I don't think anybody's saying there shouldn't be one. But I do think the investigating threshold should be higher. I think the people who investigate in these cases should do so at a higher threshold than they already are, because £10,000 fine for some brokers could close that broker down. The reputational damage is high, and oftentimes you see that actually, if you review that case, that there has been no wrongdoing. So I do think that investigatory threshold should be higher.
John, I'm going to give you the last word on ADR, and then we're going to move on.
Yeah, I think we do a lot in the mid-market and INC, and I think we should see those contracts covered as well by the regulator, the ADR provider. Most of the harm that I see in my customer base is from rogue brokers not selling to small businesses with 10,000 kilowatts. It's selling to businesses who've got 2 million kilowatts that are tied into what they thought was a fixed contract. It turns out to be a flex contract. You raise it with the supplier and they say they're a micro business, can't help them. That's where a lot of the noise and the bad press comes from. So I'd be fully supportive of the ADR scheme being rolled out to contracts of all size, because why wouldn't you?
But very, very quickly, and I think you make a really good point there. So if any regulatory framework comes in, it needs to have a route of conversations with the ADR providers. Should they find a complaint, they uphold a complaint, that should be reported back to the regulatory body, who can then take the necessary action against the broker.